The Secretary-General of the United Nations, António Guterres, has called on African leaders to push for the transformation of the multilateral system. Speaking exclusively to the SABC in Addis Ababa, the UN chief says Africa must have permanent seats in the UN Security Council. Guterres will deliver his last speech at the AU Heads of State and Government Summit in Ethiopia on Saturday.
The African Union Heads of State and Government Summit gets underway tomorrow, but I think all eyes will be on the UN Secretary General António Guterres, who will deliver a message to leaders on the continent and Africans, I guess, around the African continent. This will be his last address as the Secretary General of the United Nations here at the AU, as we know that the SG will be leaving office at the end of the year. Thank you so much for your time, SG. It has been a long marathon, one can say, in terms of your leadership at the helm of the world body. But the relationship with Africa has been very strong. You've been here many times, different countries, last year at the G20. This time around, almost like a farewell to Africa.
Well, not yet farewell, because I'm only leaving in the end of the year, and I will never say farewell to Africa. Wherever I am, whatever I'm doing, I can guarantee that in the center of my concerns and in the center of my activism of whatever kind, Africa will always be my central objective. As today, Africa is the main priority of the United Nations, and the partnership between the African Union and the UN is the most important strategic partnership that the United Nations has in today's world. Either we are all successful in making Africa overcome its present difficulties and fully benefit from the technologies that are being developed, the progress that is evolving all over the world. Either we are able to support Africa to be in the front line of progress, of development, or we as UN will completely fail. Africa for us is indeed our main priority. To support Africa, respecting that the leadership in the solution of the African problems must be an African leadership.
Tomorrow, what are you going to say to the leaders?
Well, fundamentally, our total solidarity with the African Union in the efforts to bring peace to the continent, to silence the guns, as it is the project of the African Union. And second, to say how committed we are to correct the injustices. Africa is a double victim of colonialism, because of colonialism itself and its impact and the transatlantic slave trade and all these horrible things that have happened. But because when the institutions of today's world was created, most African countries were not independent. They were subject to colonial domination. And so Africa has a deficit of representation. It's totally unacceptable that there is not one single permanent member of the African continent in the Security Council. And if you look at the international financial institutions, if you look at the international financial architecture, if you look at other global institutions, Africa is dramatically underrepresented. And the voice of Africa, that is essential in today's world, is not properly taken into account. So to reform those institutions and to give Africa the role that Africa is entitled to have, both participating in the structures and the decisions that are taken, is for us a central objective. And this is assumed by the General Assembly of the United Nations in the Pact for the Future. The reform not only of the Security Council, but of the international financial institutions and all the other instruments of multilateral governance in which the African continent must have a much stronger influence.
You spoke about peace and security. The war is still raging in Sudan. Are we likely, in any way, going to find a solution to stop the war and the killing women and children, vulnerable people?
We must do everything possible to stop that horrible war that is having horrendous consequences in the suffering of the Sudanese people. And when I was High Commissioner for Refugees, I worked in Sudan, and Sudan was very generous. The Sudanese people, with the refugees from Eritrea, refugees from South Sudan, refugees from Chad, and to see the people suffering as I see today is something that breaks my heart. So we need to stop this war. But we need to be conscious. It's not enough to bring the two parties to a serious dialogue to stop the war. Let's not forget that there are many that are interfering with the war, providing weapons and creating a much more difficult environment for a true peace negotiation between the Sudanese parties themselves. But the Sudanese must overcome this difficulty, and the Sudanese must find the Sudanese-led solution for the problem.
The DRC, another thorny issue in the Great Lakes region, both a member of the Southern Africa, but also East Africa. It looks like it's very difficult to stop the challenge in the DRC with all the peace agreement, peace processes, and later all those agreements being violated. How can we get DRC right?
Well, there is an effort that is being made. The African Union is strongly involved in that effort. SADC and the East African community were involved in this Africa. There is now a mediation led by Benin in this respect. There was a US intervention that led to an agreement between Rwanda and the DRC. There are the Doha negotiations between and the agreements already established between the DRC and the M23. But the truth is that the parties that seem to sign agreements in a relatively easy way are maintaining a very belligerent attitude on the ground, and this is totally unacceptable. I mean, we must create the conditions for these agreements that are being established to be implemented, to have a real ceasefire, and that real ceasefire to allow for a political solution that will allow to respect the integrity of the territorial integrity of the DRC, the unity of the DRC, but at the same time that addresses old problems, old root causes of this conflict that need to be effectively addressed and solved.
South Africa yesterday on Thursday, on Thursday, the president of South Africa, addressing the nation, indicated that South Africa will be pulling out of the peacekeeping mission in the DRC. South Africa has been part of MONUSC for quite a long time. Is this not going to have an impact in terms of efforts of the UN to bring peace in the DRC?
No, first of all, this is a sovereign decision of South Africa. We fully respect that corresponds to the organization of the South African forces. It comes in a moment in which we are unfortunately forced to reduce MONUSCO because we only had half of the US contribution to peacekeeping, and because of that we had to make a drastic reduction of about 25% of our troops all over the world in all peacekeeping missions, and also in MONUSCO. Obviously, even if I have a lot of interest in the contribution of South Africa, as I said, this is a sovereign decision of the government of South Africa that we fully respect. And in this difficult context in which we are, we will of course adapt the order to be able to go on providing the same service to the population.
Before we wrap up our interview, the other issue is on climate change. We've seen how countries are affected, particularly the sub-Sahara. And there seems to be reluctance by leaders, not only on the continent, around the world, to continue with a mission to ensure that we address challenges of climate change. Are you still optimistic that there can be some revival of interest to look at this critical matter?
One of the builders of the European Union was Jean Monnet, and he used to say that he was not optimistic nor pessimistic, he was determined. I am determined to do everything possible to make leaders understand all over the world that climate change is an existential threat and that we need to drastically reduce emissions at the present moment, and at the same time and the way to do it, the most important way to do it, is through the just transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy, and at the same time to invest much more in support to the countries that are impacted by climate change, in helping them to adapt, to build resilience in their communities, in their infrastructure. And Africa here is again a double victim of injustice. Africa practically does not pollute, and Africa is the continent in which the impacts of climate change have been more devastating. And on the other hand, Africa is also a victim of injustice, because Africa has 60% of the solar potential in the world, but only 2% of the investment for solar energy. Something is fundamentally wrong in the way the international financial system works.
And finally, SG, we're now wrapping up. I can't leave out Ukraine. It's still a problem, and also the Middle East. If you were to sum up, can we still be in a right track to try and stop what's happening in the Ukraine, but also Gaza?
We need to do everything possible to stop the suffering of people and to bring peace. Of course, what is dramatic is that both in Russia, Ukraine, and in Israel, Palestine, we have seen drastic violations of international law, inclusive by a permanent member of the Security Council, and we have seen a total disrespect in the case of Gaza of the rights of the Palestinian people. Of course, we all condemn what happened on the 7th of October, but the level of death and destruction that was imposed into Gaza, it's absolutely intolerable. And it is essential that a ceasefire is respected in Gaza. It is essential that Gaza is reconstructed, and it is essential that Gaza is united to the West Bank, this Jerusalem, creating the conditions for a Palestinian state. Without a Palestinian state, Israelis and Palestinians with two states living together, without that there will never be peace in the Middle East.